You think she even understands a damn word we're saying? Trent didn't even bother to lower his voice as he smirked across the table. Derek chuckled and replied, "Doubt it. But hey, $1 billion buyout for a silent sushi doll. I'll take that. Deal any day." That's how it started. Imagine a single dinner that could shatter empires. Stay tuned. Because this one did. A private dinner worth $800 million. Set in the heart of San Francisco's most exclusive rooftop restaurant, with panoramic views stretching across the bay. But what should have been a historic partnership turned into something far uglier. An unspoken war of glances, silence, and prejudice. At the head of the table sat Kamiko Hayashi, a Japanese tech billionaire who built her company from scratch. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was restraint. She didn't speak English tonight. Not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. It was her armor. And behind her, unnoticed and unseen, moved Naomi Brooks, a young black waitress with a lean frame, almond eyes, and posture like a dancer. She wasn't just refilling wine glasses. She was watching everything, every word, every microaggression, every insult whispered like it couldn't be heard. But Naomi heard it all. The smirks, the sweetheart snaps of fingers, the racial innuendos, the dismissal of Kamiko as nothing more than an exotic obstacle on their road to conquest. What happened next was not just a business reversal. It was a revolution disguised as dinner service. This isn't just another power play at a negotiation table. This is a black story. A story about the underestimated, the overlooked, and the powerful silence of women who refuse to be erased. And when Naomi finally opened her mouth, she didn't just translate. She flipped the entire room upside down. What if the person you ignored held the key to your downfall? Keep listening, you won't believe how this unfolds. So, before we dive into what happened that night, the deals, the deceit, the dignity, make sure you're following Whisper Fable. We share stories like this every week. Stories that remind us the quietest voices often carry the most weight. Because sometimes the people you ignore the most are the ones rewriting the ending. Stay with us. You'll want to hear this one. The restaurant was called the Palisade, perched on the top floor of a glass and still tower in downtown San Francisco. It wasn't just a place to eat. It was a statement. The chandeliers didn't just hang. They cascaded like frozen waterfalls. The marble floors gleamed under low amber lights and a view. A 360 panorama of a city built on ambition. Inside the private room reserved for this dinner, the atmosphere was heavy with exclusivity. Rich mahogany panels lined the walls. A long curved table of polished walnut reflected the dim glow of the candles. The scent of roasted duck, truffle oil, and expensive bourbon hung in the air. At one end of the table sat Derek Caldwell, CEO of Valancourt Biotech, tall, broad-shouldered, in a tailored gray suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His slicked-back blonde hair and perfectly timed grin belonged to a man who always expected to win. Beside him, CFO Trent Langley, younger, sharper, hungrier. His suit was darker, his watch flashier. If Derek was the king in the boardroom, Trent was the executioner. Together, they were sharks in human skin, calculating, impatient, and utterly convinced of their dominance. Across from them, the woman they believed they were about to conquer, Kamiko Hayashi, a billionaire in her own right, founder and CEO of Hoshiko AI, the Tokyo-based pioneer in surgical robotics and neural interface technologies. But tonight she was the mystery in the room. Her hair was silver, neatly pinned. Her dress, a deep indigo silk, flowed like still water. No jewelry, no makeup, just her presence. Calm, unreadable, she said nothing. Her aide, seated slightly behind her, offered soft translations when needed. But mostly Kamiko listened. Her silence made the men twitch. And then, of course, there was Naomi, the waitress. No one noticed, slipping between tables, adjusting wine levels, clearing plates. Her name wasn't on the guest list. Her voice wasn't in the room yet, but her eyes were. She watched Derek's condescending smirks. She saw Trent's restless leg bouncing under the table, and she watched Kamiko, stoic, regal, holding her ground in a room built to make her feel small. The battle lines were drawn. The room looked like luxury, but beneath the surface, something colder simmered. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a test, and none of them knew who was being tested. Not yet. The first toast was awkward. Derek lifted his glass of bourbon with the confidence of a man used to setting the tone. To global partnerships, he said, and to a future where science knows no borders. He smiled wide as if he had just delivered a line worthy of a magazine cover. Kamiko simply nodded, lifted her glass in silence, and sipped. No words, no translation. Trent leaned over, whispering, "Was that a yes or just a polite nod?" He didn't bother lowering his voice much. Kamiko said something in Japanese to her aide. The man, expressionless, turned to the table. Ms. Hayashi appreciates the sentiment. That was all, and that was the pattern. Derek would offer long animated speeches about the transformative potential of merging Hosiko AIs. Surgical robotics. With Valancourt's global distribution, he talked numbers, timelines, market capture. He smiled between sentences. He gestured as if commanding an invisible audience. Kamiko would reply in a short phrase, quiet and measured. The aide would translate, always in one sentence, always neutral. Trent's patience thinned first. He leaned in toward Derek and muttered, "Are we seriously negotiating with a statue? This is insane." Derek forced a polite smile, whispering back, "It's cultural. She's playing her game. Just be patient." But Trent wasn't wired for patience. He snapped his fingers toward Naomi, not even looking at her. "Hey, sweetheart. More of that, sir. We're going to need it." Naomi felt the sting behind the word, not. The request, the tone, the familiarity that wasn't earned. The way sweetheart felt more like a leash than a compliment. She poured the wine without saying a word, her hands steady. But her eyes were watching. Later, Trent leaned back in his chair, rolling his eyes as the aide translated yet another measured response. "You know," he said loudly, "we could probably just replace her with a chatbot. Would get more interaction." Derek chuckled. Naomi saw Kamiko's face, still calm, but something in her eyes shifted. A slinker, a wound being registered, then hidden again. They weren't talking to her. They were talking over her, runner. Through her, they saw a language barrier, but they didn't see what that barrier said about them. To them, Kamiko was a problem to solve, a figure to convert, a name on a contract. To Naomi, she looked like something else entirely, a mirror, and she could feel the tension rising. The room wasn't just getting colder, it was cracking. Naomi Brooks had always known how to disappear. She was taught, not directly, but through years of subtle lessons, in classrooms where she was the only black girl, in stores where she was followed, not greeted, in interviews where they smiled but never called back. In this restaurant, she was invisible by design. It was part of the training. Seamless service, quiet steps, eyes down, hands quick, never speak unless spoken to, make them feel special without ever being seen. But Naomi didn't always live in the shadows. There was a time when her world was filled with color, texture, and sound. Kyoto, Japan. Her mother had been a diplomat stationed there for nearly a decade. Naomi had spent her formative years walking cobbled temple paths, chasing cicadas in the summer heat and folding paper cranes in a quiet schoolroom with children who never once asked her why her skin was different. She learned Japanese before she learned sarcasm, before she learned to flinch at expectations, before she understood what it meant to be other. The language stayed with her, not just in memory, but in tone and instinct. She remembered the weight of the words, the cadence of respect embedded in every sentence. She remembered the bowing, not just of the body, but of intention. The world had been hers once, then came the move back to the States. Then came the realization that being fluent in Japanese was more impressive when said by someone who didn't look like her, that her story wasn't exotic enough, that her intelligence would always be second-guessed because she didn't look like the poster child for excellence. Now, at 24, Naomi was juggling shifts, student loans, and silent dreams. She worked 2 jobs to afford tuition at a fine arts college in Oakland. She painted at night, sketched on train rides, and served wine with a poise that came from knowing her worth, even if no one else in the room did. But that night, something stirred in her as she watched Kamiko Hayashi sit through the veiled insults and performative politeness. Naomi didn't just see a quiet billionaire. She saw someone fighting the same quiet war, someone who had power, but was still being disrespected because of her accent, her gender, her silence. And Naomi knew that silence all too well. She'd worn it like armor for years. But tonight, that silence was beginning to crack. The conversation, or what little was left of it, had begun to unravel. Derek leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the table like he was waiting for someone to cue the next act. Kamiko sat still, calm, composed, answering each question with a few precise words through her aid. Her silence was steady, her tone respectful. But to the man across from her, it was infuriating. Finally, Trent exhaled loudly through his napkin onto the table and leaned forward with a sneer. "We want to buy your company," he said, enunciating each word like he was talking to a toddler. "Do you understand?" Derek laughed, not because it was funny, but because he thought he was in control. "Maybe we should bring out some flashcards," he added, his voice drenched in condescension. Naomi nearly dropped the scarf in her hand. Her back was turned as she stood by the service station, pretending to check the wine list. But her ears burned. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter. It wasn't just the mockery. It was the tone. The assumption that if someone didn't speak like them, they were somehow less. Kamiko blinked once slowly. She didn't flinch. She didn't retaliate. But the air in the room changed just slightly. Trent smirked again. "I mean, seriously, is this a business deal or a pantomime?" And then came the final insult. "Quiet but sharp, I swear, man," he muttered to Derek, not realizing Naomi was only 5 feet away. "This is like negotiating with a bonsai tree." Derek chuckled. "Silent, decorative, probably older than it looks." Naomi turned around slowly. Her heart was racing, not with fear, but with fury. She glanced at Kamiko, still unreadable, still poised, but Naomi's sight, the tiny shift in her jaw, the quiet storm behind her eyes. Then Naomi felt a hand on her shoulder. It was her manager, Fuster. "Don't get involved," he whispered. "You speak only when spoken to. Do your job," she nodded. But something inside her had already broken loose. Kamiko spoke in Japanese, a phrase not translated by her aide, not for the men at the table, a whisper almost to herself. Naomi heard it clearly. "Is there no one here who sees me?" And just like that, Naomi knew this wasn't just cultural ignorance. It was intentional. It was systemic, and she could no longer stay silent. The room had fallen into a peculiar kind of stillness. Trent had leaned back, clearly pleased with his bonsai comment. Derek was pouring himself another finger of bourbon, wearing the smug look of a man who thought he had just closed a deal. The aide, ever professional, sat in silence, and Kamiko, she hadn't moved. But then, softly, she spoke again, a sentence, just one, not for translation, not for the men. It was directed into the space between them, as if she were casting her voice into a canyon and hoping someone, anyone, might echo back. Naomi heard every syllable. "Watishio Hanto, and I mad-eyed. Ayuno wa koko, and I dare Ayuno ka. Is there truly anyone here who sees me?" The words struck Naomi like a chord vibrating deep in her chest. It wasn't just the meaning. It was the ache behind it. That kind of sadness didn't come from weakness. It came from being erased in plain sight. Naomi stepped back from the wall. For a second, her hands trembled. She could feel the pressure of protocol gripping her, the fear of being fired, the warning from Foster still hot in her ear. But that one sentence, Those few soft words from Kamiko made every rule she had ever followed feel unbearably small. She moved toward the table. The click of her shoes against the hardwood floor echoed in the sudden silence. Derek glanced up, irritated. Trent frowned. Her manager was frozen in disbelief. Naomi didn't stop. She approached Kamiko's side, bowed, low at the waist. Not the shallow nod of customer service, but the deep formal bow of reverence, a bow reserved for elders, for sensei, for people whose presence carried weight beyond words. Then slowly she rose, looked Kamiko in the eye, and spoke in crisp, fluent Japanese. Hayashi-sama, I am deeply sorry. I know I am not supposed to speak, but silence in the face of this kind of disrespect is its own form of betrayal. If you will allow me, I can help. Derek dropped his glass against the table with a dull thud. Trent's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The aide blinked, stunned. Kimiko's eyes widened, not in shock, but in recognition, like someone stranded at sea, finally spotting a lighthouse through the fog. She reached forward, gently touched Naomi's arm, and whispered back in Japanese, "Thank you for seeing me." And just like that, the balance of power in the room shifted. Naomi hadn't just spoken, she had changed everything. Kamiko leaned back in her chair for the first time that night, her eyes never leaving Naomi. She gave a subtle nod. It was not just permission, it was trust. Naomi stepped forward, her voice, steady now, filled the room like a current of clarity. Hayashi-sana has requested that I translate her statements moving forward, she said, directing her words to Derek and Trent. She believes it is time you understand the full weight of what's being said. Trent laughed nervously. Sure, he said. Let's hear it. Naomi turned back to Kamiko. They exchanged a brief sentence in Japanese, measured, deliberate. Then Naomi turned toward the table again. Her posture straight, her voice calm. She would like to begin by discussing the revised contract you brought tonight. Derek reached into his briefcase and slid the leather folder toward Naomi. It's all there, he said, clean. Straightforward, more than sir. Naomi opened the folder, scanned the first few pages. Her heart rate quickened, not from fear this time, but focus. She wasn't a lawyer, but she had spent enough nights helping her mother proofread diplomatic briefs to recognize certain patterns, language that sounded generous, but had sharp edges. She flipped to section 7b. Her eyes paused. This clause, she said slowly, gives Valancourt unrestricted rights to renegotiate all intellectual property licenses post-merger. That includes the surgical AI Kamiko Hayashi personally developed. Derek blinked. That's standard merger language. Naomi shook her head. No, it's intentionally vague. It allows you to sell off her patents, strip the core technology without needing approval. Trent waved his hand. It's a safeguard just in case things shift post-acquisition. Naomi didn't even look at him. She continued flipping pages. Section 12, she said, her tone sharpening. This is a non-compete clause, but it's written so broadly. It wouldn't just prevent Ms. Hayashi from starting a new tech firm. It would prevent her from consulting, teaching, speaking at conferences. For 10 years, she looked directly at them now. You're not just trying to buy her company. You're trying to erase her from the industry. The silence that followed was heavy. Derek's jaw tightened. Trent muttered something under his breath. Their confidence, their smug control, it was slipping. And Tico, she hadn't said a word, but her face held the quiet satisfaction of a chess player watching a checkmate unfold. One move at a time, Naomi had cracked the code. And now the trap was wide open. The air in the room had gone still, danced still. Trent fidgeted with his pen. Derek cleared his throat, his eyes darting to the window. If the city lights could offer him an escape. But there was no getting out of this. Naomi closed the contract folder slowly, her hands precise, her eyes unwavering. And then Kamiko spoke this time. Her voice was soft, but carried a new kind of weight. She gave a single instruction in Japanese to her aide, who nodded without a word. From the inside pocket of his blazer, the aide produced a small silver device. It was sleek, no bigger than a phone. He placed it gently on the table and pressed play, the first only static. Then came Derek's voice, sharp and mistakable. Let's just get to the final offer. Cut out the incentive clauses. We'll absorb her execs. She'll never know the difference. Trent's laugh followed, full of teeth. She's lost in her own little world. We feed her whatever we want. The translator does the heavy lifting. The audio was clear, damning, echoing against the expensive wood and glass of the private dining room. Naomi didn't flinch. She translated the essence of what had been said. Even though the meaning was painfully obvious, they assumed she didn't understand, she said. They joked about manipulating the terms. They laughed about silencing her team. They made a plan to dismantle her legacy in front of her, banking on her silence. Trent stood abruptly. You can't record private meetings without consent. That's illegal. Naomi turned to him, cool and steady. So is fraud. Derek stayed seated, but the color had drained from his face. He looked at Kamiko, really looked at her. For the first time, she wasn't small. She wasn't silent. She was a fortress, and she had just opened fire. Kamiko didn't smile. She didn't need to. The recording clicked off with a final metallic beep. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was judgment, a verdict. Naomi folded her hands in front of her. Her voice was low but strong. You didn't just underestimate a woman. You underestimated the wrong woman. And you forgot that silence doesn't mean surrender. This wasn't business as usual anymore. This was war. And Kamiko Hayashi had just won the first battle. The door slammed open. Naomi barely had time to turn before her manager stormed in. His face flushed with fury. Foster was usually cold, composed, the kind of man who spoke in half sentences and raised eyebrows. But not tonight. Tonight, he looked like a man seconds away from exploding. What the hell was that? He hissed, stepping past the stunned executives, ignoring Kamiko completely. His voice was low but venomous. You left your station. You inserted yourself into a private meeting. You spoke to a guest. Naomi stood still. She didn't speak. She didn't flinch. You're done. He snapped. You're finished here. Naomi, I don't care what the excuse is. You're fired. Immediately. Trent scoffed in the background. Finally, something this place gets right. Naomi clenched her jaw. Her hands stayed by her sides. But inside, her chest burned. Not with regret, but with something sharper, something heavier. She had done the right thing. She knew it. And this was her reward. Pack your things. Foster spat. Security will escort you out. Naomi was about to reply. She wasn't sure what she would say, but she didn't get the chance. A deep voice cut across the room. Actually, she's not going anywhere. Everyone turned. A tall, sharply dressed black man stood just inside the open door. Early 40s, clean-shaven, calm as a surgeon in an operating room. He wore a navy suit that didn't try to show off. It didn't need to. His presence said everything. My Jones, he said, stepping forward. Executive Director, North American Innovation Alliance, and one of the key financial partners behind Hosiko's expansion into the U.S. Foster blinked like he'd been slapped. Derek's face turned a deeper shade of gray. I've been sitting in the main dining room for the past 20 minutes. Mike continued, watching this unfold, listening to their recording, watching how each of you behaved. His eyes locked on Foster. You're not firing Naomi Brooks tonight. In fact, she should be getting a formal apology. Foster opened his mouth, but no words came. My turn to Naomi. And for the first time that evening, she felt truly seen, not as staff, not as background, but as a person of value. You were the only one in this room who understood what integrity looks like. Naomi's throat tightened, and the balance shifted again. Not because of rank or money, but because one voice had the courage to speak, and another had the power to make sure it was heard. The private room was quiet now, still charged, but no longer tense. Foster had backed away, his shoulders stiff with humiliation. Derek and Trent sat silently, their power drained. Their arrogance turned into something almost pitiful, and Naomi stood in the middle of it all, her apron still tied neatly round her waist, her posture unchanged. But everything else about her had shifted. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the woman who had changed the course of a multi-million-dollar deal with her voice and her courage. Kamiko turned toward her for the first time all night. Her expression softened. She spoke gently in Japanese, her words elegant and measured. Naomi listened, her chest rising and falling with each syllable. Then she turned to Mai, translated softly, and gave a quiet nod. Mai stepped forward. Miss Hayashi has the request, he said, addressing Naomi directly. She would like to formally offer you a position with Hoshiko's global strategy team, not just as a cultural liaison, but as an executive aide, someone who understands the unspoken, who listens between the lines. Naomi blinked. She wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. You'd be based in San Francisco, Mike continued. You'd help lead our U.S. expansion, advise on international partnerships, and oversee future diversity initiatives within the company. He paused, letting that settle. Your tuition covered. Any graduate program you choose, anywhere in the world, fully funded. You'll have housing provided near our offices, and a starting salary that reflects the value you've already proven you bring. Naomi felt her breath catch. The floor beneath her feet suddenly felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. This couldn't be real. Kamiko stood. She crossed the room slowly, meeting Naomi face to face. She didn't offer a handshake. Instead, she reached out and took Naomi's hand gently in both of hers. You saw me, she said in soft, accented English when no one else did. Naomi nodded, her voice caught in her throat. I'd be honored. She finally whispered. Truly, Kamiko smiled. Then come with us. We have work to do, real work. And just like that, the door that had been closed her entire life wasn't just open, it had been blown off its hinges. A new future was waiting, and Naomi Brooks was finally walking through it. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, news of the failed negotiation leaked. Not from Kamiko, not from Naomi, but through back channels in the tech world that had a life of their own. The recording, discreetly shared with legal counsel and a few key partners, found its way into the hands of corporate oversight committees. Valancourt's board acted fast. Derek Caldwell was asked to step down voluntarily in a closed-door meeting that lasted less than an hour. His golden parachute was shredded. His name was removed from the company website by noon. Trent Langley resigned 2 days later, citing personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. Investors were rattled. Stockholders demanded answers. And the press, well, the press had a field day. The story was simple but powerful. To wealthy white executives caught on tape trying to manipulate and erase the legacy of a foreign female founder brought down by a black waitress who simply told the truth. Headlines didn't need much help. From server to savior, the woman who stopped an $800 million power grab. The internet called it poetic justice. Comment sections filled with praise for Naomi Brooks, for Kamiko Hayashi for the simple but radical act of speaking up when it mattered most. As for Derek and Trent, their reputations were tarnished beyond repair. Doors that had once opened automatically for them now stayed shut. Invitations to speak at conferences were quietly withdrawn. Future partnerships vanished like mist in the morning sun. They had underestimated one woman's silence and another woman's voice, and in doing so, they reminded the world of a truth they had long forgotten. Real power doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears an apron, and sometimes the people you never thought mattered are the ones who change everything. This wasn't just a story about corporate betrayal or a surprise twist in a business deal. It was a story about visibility, about dignity, about what happens when the world assumes silence means weakness, and when it dismisses people because of how they look, where they're from, or the uniform they wear. Naomi Brooks was never just a waitress. She was a young woman carrying years of lived experience, a deep understanding of culture, and a quiet strength most people overlooked. She saw what others refused to see. She heard what others ignored. And when the moment came, she chose not comfort but courage. And Kamiko Hayashi, she was a billionaire. Yes, but that night, she was also a woman being spoken over, underestimated, and reduced to a stereotype. Her power wasn't in her money. It was in her composure, her discipline, and her choice to wait, not for the right deal, but for the right people. Both women faced a room that tried to define them by their silence. But in the end, they redefined that room. The truth is, most people don't see what's right in front of them. They see a title, a skin tone, a job description. They assume, they categorize, they move on. But the world changes when someone stops and really listens. So, here's the takeaway. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Never ignore the person clearing your table, answering your call, or sitting silently at the far end of a meeting room. You have no idea what they know or what they're capable of. And if you are one of those quiet ones, if you've ever felt invisible, undervalued, overlooked, know this, your voice matters. Your presence matters. And one day, when it counts most, the world will finally hear you. This was a black story, but it's also a human story. If this moment meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you've overlooked, or someone who once stood up for you, share it, let it ripple, let someone else hear it. And if you want more stories like this, true stories that challenge how we see each other, hit that subscribe button on Whisper Fable and turn on notifications, because we're not done telling them, not even close.